night sky above the Baltic flared with strange lights. Balloons unmanned, silent, and drifting crossed Lithuania's borders 3 nights in a row. Then on October 27th, 2025, everything changed. In a single stunning announcement, Lithuania shut down every crossing with Belarus. Roads that once carried thousands of trucks went dead. Engines idled, horns blared in despair. The bridge connecting Russia to its western fortress Kaliningrad was gone. A lifeline severed without a single shot fired. Could this be the moment when Moscow's most prized outpost becomes its greatest burden? Lithuania's decision wasn't about balloons. It was about sovereignty and strategy. Officials in Vilnius declared their airspace violated and their patience exhausted. For months, NATO radar stations had tracked Russian drones hovering near Finnish and Estonian skies. The pattern was clear pressure provocation probing, but this time, the West answered not with words, but with walls. Kaliningrad, home to Russia's Baltic fleet nuclear-capable missiles, and nearly 500,000 civilians, was suddenly surrounded. To its west and south lies Poland, to the north and east Lithuania. Beyond those borders, NATO flags now dominate the horizon. For decades, this region was Putin's dagger pointed at Europe. Now it is a trapped relic, an island of steel and fear. Strategically, this closure marked a turning point. Reuters analysts described it as a silent blockade executed with legal precision. DW reported that the move transformed Lithuania from a transit state into NATO's frontline gatekeeper. Jane's Defense Weekly noted that the closure effectively neutralized Kaliningrad's land-based logistics, crippling its military readiness within hours. The parallels are striking, like the supply siege of Mariupol in Ukraine or the isolation of Gaza during the Israel-Iran shadow war. This new Baltic wall represents a hybrid form of warfare, economic, psychological, and strategic. Each blockade tells the same story: control the arteries, and the heart begins to fail. For Moscow, the fallout was immediate. Hundreds of trucks were trapped between borders. Diesel shortages began within days. Supermarkets in Kaliningrad reported empty shelves. The Guardian cited images of drivers sleeping in frozen cabins, waiting for borders that would never reopen. In a war defined by drones and propaganda, this was a new kind of siege, silent, bureaucratic, devastating. Beyond logistics lies the human toll. Families separated, prices doubling overnight, panic rising with every rumor. DW's Baltic correspondents described a creeping sense of abandonment as locals watched NATO surveillance aircraft circle above their contrails, forming white scars across a darkening sky. Yet the deeper question remains: what happens when isolation turns desperation into defiance? Will Moscow attempt to break the blockade, or will Kaliningrad become a symbol of a broader unraveling, one that begins not with a missile strike, but with the slow suffocation of a state's geography? The world is watching. The Baltic has gone silent, and in that silence, one truth grows louder than ever. Power today is not held by those who shout, but by those who can close a gate and wait. At dawn, the map of Europe looked different. The red lines of Russia's borders no longer reached Kaliningrad by land. A small exclave on the Baltic Sea, once the spearhead of Russian power in Europe, had become an island. Geography, the old enemy of empires, had returned to claim its due. To understand the gravity of Lithuania's decision, one must look closely at the terrain. Kaliningrad, wedged between Poland and Lithuania, has no land connection to the Russian mainland. Every road, every railway, every truck carrying goods or ammunition must cross foreign soil. It is an enclave of concrete and command posts trapped in NATO's tightening embrace. In peacetime, geography defines trade. In wartime, it defines survival. And now for Russia, the corridor that once linked its mainland to Kaliningrad through Belarus lies closed. According to BBC News, nearly 700 trucks were immobilized in the first 24 hours, most carrying fuel, food, and spare parts vital for both civilians and the military. Lithuanian border officials called the closure indefinite. For Moscow, that single word spelled catastrophe. Defense news analysts described Kaliningrad as a modern-day Gibraltar turned inside out, not a fortress projecting strength, but a stronghold cut off from its lifeblood. The once proud Baltic fleet, with its Iskander missile brigades and air defense batteries, is now confined to the port, unable to move without NATO noticing. Every sea route passes under the eyes of Swedish, Finnish, and Polish radar networks. Every radio signal is intercepted. This geographic trap did not appear overnight. It was built slowly, year after year, through expansion and alignment. When Finland and Sweden joined NATO, the Baltic Sea effectively became a Western-controlled zone. Al Jazeera called it a NATO lake with Russian islands floating inside. Kaliningrad is the largest and loneliest of those islands. Moscow's planners once saw this outpost as their gateway to Europe. Now it is their Achilles heel. Without the Lithuanian-Belarusian land bridge, even basic resupply becomes an operation of high risk and high cost. Civilian air corridors can move passengers, but not tanks, fuel, or factory equipment. Sea routes are monitored, vulnerable, and narrow. As one former NATO general told The Guardian, Kaliningrad has gone from being a threat to being a hostage. This isolation has ripple effects far beyond the Baltic. Just as the Ukrainian counteroffensive exposed the fragility of Russia's logistics on land, Lithuania's decision exposes its fragility at sea. The pattern repeats: Moscow overextends, its enemies constrict. Across the world, similar fault lines appear. In the Persian Gulf, Iran's supply routes are under constant surveillance from US fleets. In the South China Sea, American and Chinese warships shadow each other through contested corridors. Every superpower faces the same test: how to project power when geography turns against you. But Kaliningrad is different. It is not an outpost thousands of miles away. It is a piece of Russia stranded inside NATO's front yard. For the people of Kaliningrad, the map is now more than a symbol, it is a cage. Every route that once led east now ends at a checkpoint sealed with steel barriers and NATO flags. Even as Russia broadcasts defiant messages about resilience and sovereignty, reality tells another story. Supermarkets are emptying, banks are rationing cash, the once bustling ports are quiet. And yet the greatest danger is not what Moscow loses, but how it might choose to respond. History teaches that wounded powers lash out. Will Russia gamble on reopening the corridor by force? Or will the Kremlin turn its rage inward, tightening its grip at home as its influence abroad erodes? The geography that once promised power now demands a price. And in Kaliningrad, that price is beginning to rise by the hour. Engines roared, then died. Hundreds of trucks stretched across the Lithuanian-Belarusian border, forming a silent convoy of despair. Some drivers had been waiting for 2 days, others for a week. Refrigerated cargo spoiled. Diesel tanks ran dry. Food ran out. No way in, no way out, Reuters quoted one Lithuanian customs official saying, "It's like the border became concrete overnight." Inside Kaliningrad, panic was spreading faster than news could keep up. Fuel stations shut down. Grocery stores began limiting essentials to 1 item per person. The Guardian reported a visible atmosphere of anxiety as lines formed outside supermarkets and pharmacies. Local telegram channels buzzed with rumors of rationing. The exclave, once a proud showcase of Russia's western might, was on the verge of economic collapse. Factories like Avtotor, once producing thousands of vehicles a month, faced ruin. Their supply chains depended on parts from the Russian mainland. With the borders closed, assembly lines froze. Defense News estimated that within 10 days, industrial production could fall by 60%. Workers were sent home, paychecks stopped. A chill of uncertainty settled over the city. Economically, Kaliningrad was built like a lung. It breathed through Lithuania and Belarus. When that airway closed, suffocation began. Moscow's emergency response was chaotic. Cargo planes were dispatched to bring basic goods, but air capacity was a fraction of what land convoys could carry. The BBC calculated that one average highway convoy delivered as much as 20 Il-76 cargo planes. The math was brutal. Survival by air alone was impossible. The Kremlin accused Lithuania of economic terrorism. Vilnius responded coolly, "We are defending our airspace and our sovereignty." Behind the diplomacy, though, was a cold truth: Lithuania had found Russia's weak spot and pressed hard. DW described it as a non-military strike with the force of a blockade. Meanwhile, Western capitals quietly celebrated the move's precision. No missiles, no soldiers yet. The effects were devastating. The situation echoed the economic siege tactics seen elsewhere in the world: Israel's restrictions on Gaza, or the sanctions that strangled Iran's oil trade. In each case, control over logistics became control over destiny. But Kaliningrad's crisis hit deeper. It wasn't just about trade, it was about pride. For decades, the Kremlin portrayed the exclave as a symbol of Russian endurance inside a hostile West. Now it stood as a symbol of vulnerability. Al Jazeera reported that even Russian state media struggled to explain why an enclave so heavily militarized could be brought to its knees without a single shot. Social unrest began to flicker. Videos surfaced showing scuffles near fuel depots. A group of residents clashed with police after demanding cheaper bread. Jane's Defense Weekly noted that security forces in Kaliningrad were reinforced with troops from the Baltic fleet, an unusual move signaling internal instability. At the same time, the Baltic nations tightened cooperation. Poland and Estonia reinforced their borders. NATO logistics expanded near the Suwałki Gap. American reconnaissance drones circled overhead, monitoring every movement. President Trump, in a televised statement from the White House, praised Lithuania's firm defense of European security and vowed that the United States will stand with its allies on the Baltic frontier. For Moscow, the message was unmistakable. The West was unified and Kaliningrad was isolated. The deeper question, however, lay beyond logistics. What happens when economic collapse turns into political collapse? Could Kaliningrad, cut off and desperate, become the spark of dissent that Russia fears most? As night fell, the last trucks shut off their engines. The border lights dimmed, and somewhere beyond the checkpoints, a Russian general stared at the map, realizing that the most powerful weapons, money, morale, and mobility, were slipping beyond his reach. The siege had no walls, no gunfire, and no end in sight, only silence and the slow, certain rhythm of a region suffocating in real time. The sea once offered escape, not anymore. The Baltic, once dotted with Russian trawlers and warships, has turned into a trap, a steel-blue prison under NATO command. When Finland and Sweden joined the alliance, the geography of Europe shifted overnight. The Baltic Sea, long called Russia's Western Gate, became NATO's moat. On Gotland Island, the Swedish military's unsinkable aircraft carrier radar towers now scan the horizon 24 hours a day. The Guardian reported that new batteries of RBS-15 and naval strike missiles have been deployed, forming what defense experts call a kill box from shore to shore. Every Russian vessel leaving St. Petersburg or Kaliningrad now sails under crosshairs. Jane's Defense Weekly described the transformation bluntly. The Baltic is no longer a passage, it's a cage. The Russian Baltic fleet, once Moscow's proud maritime fist, is now split in two, one half, trapped in St. Petersburg's Gulf of Finland, the other immobilized in Kaliningrad's port. Between them lies a corridor of death, watched by NATO's most advanced systems, Sweden's coastal sensors, Finland's missile grids, and Poland's Patriot batteries. Each Russian ship that dares to move is shadowed by drones and satellites. A single launch of a cargo vessel toward Kaliningrad is enough to trigger a chain reaction of alerts across NATO command centers in Brussels and Ramstein. The BBC called it a silent war of radars. At sea, logistics are everything. Without maritime resupply, Kaliningrad is condemned to starve. But Moscow has few options. Every supply route now passes through NATO-monitored waters. Every convoy must survive a gauntlet where even a fishing trawler can be tracked, tagged, and shadowed by a missile cruiser. Defense News quoted a U.S. Navy analyst: Kaliningrad is no longer a forward base, it's a liability. Every ton of cargo that reaches it now costs Moscow more than it's worth. The transformation is profound. For decades, Russia used Kaliningrad as leverage, deploying Iskander missiles and air defense networks to threaten Europe. But the new NATO wall has turned that leverage inside out. The same missiles once aimed westward are now useless, trapped behind an economic blockade. The fortress has become the prisoner. Globally, the implications ripple outward. In the Black Sea, Ukraine's counter-blockades have mirrored NATO's precision isolating Russian ports with drone strikes and maritime mines. In the Middle East, Iran's Revolutionary Guard faces similar containment as U.S. carrier groups cut off smuggling routes. And in the South China Sea, Beijing now sees how a coalition can use geography itself as a weapon. In every case, the pattern is identical: control the corridors and you control the war. Lithuania's closure was the first domino, the NATO sea cage is the second. Inside the Kremlin, frustration simmers. Reports from DW suggest that Moscow has increased naval patrols and GPS jamming operations across the Baltic, but each move only provokes a sharper NATO response. Swedish and Finnish F-35s patrol the skies. US destroyers anchor off Gdansk. The message is unmistakable: the Baltic belongs to NATO now. Meanwhile, Kaliningrad's docks lie silent. Cargo cranes rust in the salt air. Civilians watch the horizon, hoping for ships that will never come. It is a rare moment in modern history when geography itself delivers the verdict. The Baltic Sea, once Russia's window to the world, has turned into a mirror reflecting the limits of power, the cost of aggression, and the inevitability of isolation. And so the question echoes beyond the frozen waves: when an empire's sea becomes its prison, what remains of its reach? When land and sea are sealed, only the sky remains. Moscow's final hope for Kaliningrad now lies in the clouds, a fragile air bridge connecting the exclave to St. Petersburg. But even that sky is no longer free. At sunrise, an Ilyushin Il-76 transport plane thunders down the runway. Its cargo bay is loaded with food, medicine, spare parts, essentials for a population slowly starving behind NATO's new wall. The flight path is narrow, threading through an internationally monitored corridor over the Baltic Sea. To its pilots, every kilometer feels like a gamble. Beyond radar range, unseen hunters wait. According to Reuters, NATO surveillance has turned the Baltic's airspace into one of the densest digital networks on Earth. American RQ-4 Global Hawk drones orbit from dawn till dusk. AWACS aircraft from Germany and the UK feed real-time radar to Allied command centers. In the skies above Gotland, Swedish Gripen fighters conduct silent escorts, their missiles armed, their intent unmistakable. For Russia, every flight is a humiliation. Jane's Defense Weekly calls it an airlift under siege. The cost of one cargo mission rivals the monthly budget of a regional city, and each journey carries the risk of an international incident, a minor deviation, a scrambled NATO jet, a single radar lock, any could ignite confrontation. The BBC reports that President Trump's administration has expanded air patrols along NATO's northern flank, authorizing close observation of any unauthorized Russian aircraft entering the Baltic flight corridors. The message is simple: every plane will be seen and every movement will be challenged. This isn't just about planes, it's about perception. Kaliningrad's isolation is now broadcast in real time across global news feeds. Satellite images show idle ports, grounded fleets, and empty highways. The Guardian describes it as the slowest collapse in modern military history, a strangulation in daylight. The parallel to other regions is haunting. In Ukraine, Russian forces face similar strangulation when their supply lines collapsed near Tokmak. In Gaza, humanitarian airlifts replace ground routes under siege. In Taiwan, planners quietly note how an air bridge cannot sustain a modern economy. Everywhere the lesson is the same: once the arteries close, the heart falters. Lithuania's decision to cite airspace violations by balloons may sound trivial, but as DW observed, it gave NATO perfect legal cover. Under the pretext of air defense, the alliance established a near-total electronic barrier, a digital iron curtain. Russian communications are jammed, drone feeds disrupted. Even the S-400 systems in Kaliningrad, the pride of Moscow's air defense, are being blinded by EA-18G Growlers and cyber warfare aircraft patrolling nearby. Al Jazeera reported that NATO's electronic warfare doctrine has shifted from passive defense to active interference. The Baltic skies are now a living experiment in 21st century containment, no bullets, only bandwidth. Inside Kaliningrad, people watch contrails trace the heavens, knowing each one could be the last link to the mainland. Children wave at planes that vanish into clouds. Mothers count the days until shelves empty again. The sound of jets overhead, once a symbol of protection, now feels like surveillance. In Moscow, frustration borders on desperation. The Kremlin blames Lithuania, NATO, and Western hysteria, yet even state television can't disguise the truth. Russia's fortress has become a cage, and its wings are clipped. The question now is not whether Moscow can reopen the sky, but how long it can afford to keep flying. Every mission burns through dwindling reserves. Every escort from NATO tests the limits of restraint. How long before one wrong maneuver turns a silent blockade into open war? And if the sky itself turns against Russia, where will it turn next? When the air bridge weakens and silence replaces strategy, a new reality sets in. Russia's western stronghold is no longer an asset, it's a liability. Kaliningrad, the so-called dagger in NATO's heart, has become a stranded relic of an empire outpaced by geography and time. In Moscow, the shock is palpable. Kremlin advisors whisper of betrayal by the elements, by circumstance, by the very terrain they once believed eternal. For years, Putin relied on hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, migrant waves, disinformation to divide NATO. But Lithuania's decision, triggered by those mysterious balloons, turned his own playbook against him. In trying to fracture Europe, he forced it into unity. According to Reuters, Western intelligence now views Kaliningrad as a self-contained Russian problem. The exclave's military garrison, estimated at 15,000 troops, is cut off from regular resupply. Fuel reserves are dwindling. Maintenance cycles for aircraft and armor are breaking down. Defense News notes that Kaliningrad is no longer a launching platform. It is a hostage that must be fed, guarded, and explained. This marks the first visible crack in Russia's post-Ukraine strategy. For the West, it's proof that geography, diplomacy, and technology can defeat firepower. For Moscow, it's humiliation wrapped in inevitability. The BBC reports that President Trump's National Security Council hailed the Baltic closure as a decisive victory for Allied deterrence. In Washington, strategists describe it as a model for zero non-kinetic containment, a way to weaken an adversary without a single missile launch. For the first time in decades, NATO has imposed dominance not through force but through denial. Globally, this echoes across conflict zones. In the Middle East, Iran faces similar isolation as trade routes constrict under sanctions. In East Asia, China studies this moment carefully, knowing that maritime choke points like the Taiwan Strait or the Luzon Corridor could one day mirror Kaliningrad's fate. The map of the future, it seems, is not drawn by battles, but by blockades. Inside Kaliningrad, despair deepens. DW reports that unemployment has tripled. The Guardian describes long lines outside bakeries and whispers of evacuation plans. Factories are silent. Families hoard canned food. The once bustling port city, proud of its Russian heritage, now feels abandoned. A soldier guarding the docks reportedly told a journalist, "We have guns, but we can't eat bullets." For Putin, the optics are disastrous. What began as a mission to encircle NATO has left him encircled instead. Every provocation, the drone flights, the border pressure, the hybrid operations has backfired. NATO forces are more united, better positioned, and technologically dominant than at any time since the Cold War. Al Jazeera summed it up. The siege of Kaliningrad is not an event, it's an evolution. A quiet, disciplined demonstration of how democracies win wars. They never start. Yet the story isn't over. Power abhors a vacuum and desperation breeds danger. What if Moscow, cornered and humiliated, seeks a new distraction perhaps in the Arctic or along the Pacific frontier? Could this silent defeat push Russia toward more reckless moves abroad or even internal unrest at home? The fall of Kaliningrad's land bridge has revealed more than a logistical flaw. It has exposed the limits of Russian ambition. No longer the spearhead of power, the exclave has become a symbol of overreach, trapped between NATO's patience and Putin's pride. As the Baltic night descends once again, the question remains, how long can an empire survive when its strongest fortress becomes its prison? And if this is how Russia's reach ends, not with an explosion, but with a quiet closing of gates, what lessons will the next great powers draw from it? In late October 2025, Lithuania closed its borders with Belarus, cutting off Kaliningrad, Russia's westernmost exclave, from the mainland. The move, prompted by repeated airspace violations, severed the last land bridge connecting Russia to the Baltic coast. Within days, hundreds of trucks where stranded supply chains collapsed and panic spread through Kaliningrad. As NATO reinforced its position, the Baltic Sea effectively became a NATO lake, transforming Kaliningrad from a military stronghold into an isolated outpost. Finland, Sweden, and Poland tightened their defense grids, while US surveillance and air patrols under President Trump's directive ensured total dominance of the region's airspace. Russia's attempts to maintain an air bridge faltered under NATO's digital and electronic superiority. Economically strangled and politically humiliated Kaliningrad became the symbol of Moscow's strategic failure. The crisis reshaped global perceptions of power. Blockades replaced bombs, technology replaced fire, and geography once again became destiny. In the New World Order, Kaliningrad stands as a warning that even great powers can be undone not by invasion but by isolation.